This morning, we have a neat passage from 1 Corinthians 1, and it's got a lot of words in there that, I don't know, we don't use too often in our tradition. There are words that sometimes we find hard to identify with. Sanctified. You ever use that word by yourself? Sanctified. Yeah. Called. Might be getting a little closer. Holy. Right here. You ever call yourself holy? I don't see it. Saints. 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 How about changed? You ever said you've changed? Have an experience where you've changed? We usually don't feel that way. But all those words, really, sanctified, saint, they just mean that you've been set apart for a special service for God. That's all that meant. It's kind of like we sanctify the bread and the wine before we have communion. It's going to be used for a special, separate service. You're sanctified when you're set aside for a special service. We often don't feel that way. We live in a world that helps us focus on our deficiencies and not on being complete the way we are, being God's child the way we are, and all of our humans. As parents, sometimes we're deeply scrutinized about the way we parent our children. And we could probably find all sorts of lists on the internet of things you ought to do to be an effective parent. We live in a world where often we feel insecure. And we feel like there's nothing that we can do about the problems in the world. And that, in essence, too, that we can never change. And that we can never change the world. But if we look back, we can see that things have changed. And there are people who've made a difference. In our Call to Care group, one of the things that is that there's not really any skill required. You are who you are, and that's what God needs. It's your presence that people need, not your ability to pray. Not some skill you might have to answer one of their deep questions. You're sufficient in yourself. You've been sanctified. You've become a saint because you fulfill a responsibility that God gave you. Oftentimes, as we look at the leadership in the church, we always ask ourselves, how can we meet these challenges? How can we create these programs that we know that we need in the community? How can those things happen? They happen because of the desire that's within us, because of the things that God has given us in a natural way. And we don't have to be super saints or particularly holy. We just have to be about that work that we feel God has called us to. The things that help us to come alive. Where seldom is heard a discouraging word. How many of you can identify where that comes from? Roy, Tom? You guys know the great song, right? You may not know it was written in the mid-19th century, just a few years after the Civil War. People were becoming dissatisfied with life in the East and with big city life, I guess it is. It began to move west, and that was written by a doctor who moved out to Kansas, and he wrote a poem, My Home on the Range. And then it was a few years later that it was set to music, and then a few years after that it became the state song of Kansas. Home, home on the range. You remember the rest of that? Where the deer and the antelope play. You guys know this. We probably have to sing that. Oh, man. We could have sang it. Where seldom is heard Sadio Bay, boy, it's an idyllic image, isn't it? Where seldom is heard a discouraging word. Isn't that an interesting thing for that doctor to write in a poem about heading west and getting away from other people? I kind of wonder, do deer and antelope ever give one another a discouraging word? I don't know. I've never seen it. Think about the world that we live in, the world of discouraging words. Some of you may know that my letter to the editor in the paper yesterday for the King event. I try to do that every year because I really believe in the King event, something that helps me to come alive because of the things he talked about. Talk about having a conviction about equality and about freedom. I had a friend, I've had a couple of friends, I should say, who've written letters to the editor in our local paper here, and one of them in particular was particularly proud of the large editorial that he wrote about the cost of war. And he's not particularly tech savvy and doesn't check the Daily Record often to see the comments that are written after you write a letter to the editor. And I looked at his comments, and then I read down and I read all the bad things people were saying about him personally because of the article that he wrote. And I happened to mention to him that I saw his article and I read it online. He goes, "Oh, really? I'll have to read it there too." And I said, "Oh, no, that's all right. That's all right. Don't go there to read it." And, it was fine. I really liked it. Because I didn't want him to see all the discouraging words that were written in the commentary underneath the letter to the editor. And I've checked today to see if anybody commented on my letter to the editor. It was zero. It was zero. Not true for the others, though, and you folks know what I mean. If you have a Facebook account and you happen to post something, you can pretty much expect that there will be a discouraging word about the thing that you are passionate about. Now, the thing you have to understand about this passage here is that Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and the church in Corinth is a terrible place. They're making all sorts of mistakes. Later on in the letter, he talks about that, but at the beginning, he talks about nothing but them being sanctified, that they're saints, and they're holy, and they've been called by God, and they've been changed to do some good thing in the world. And that's what he begins with. Gratitude. With holding up the fact that we can do anything as long as we believe that God is faithful. And that we would do anything at all in this world. We would be able to do anything we could possibly imagine with our minds if we believe what Paul is saying in this passage. God is faithful. If God is faithful, then we can achieve any kind of change that we want to see. There's a process in a beehive. We have a beehive. We have a beehive in a stained glass window, which I think is very interesting. The image of the church goes back to the Middle Ages. We all, kind of gather the honey and we go out into the world. And there's a phenomenon called royal jelly, or royal honey. And what happens is when a hive needs to create the new queen, they take all this supercharged protein honey and surround a cell with a growing little baby. And you can see, I wish that I had projection today. I could show you actual pictures of royal jelly that they surround these little bees with so that they continue to grow into a queen. Sometimes it's been like a Big Mac. It's called special sauce in beekeeping worlds. Isn't that what we do to our children? Isn't that what we do in the infancy of any kind of a program? We surround it with royal jelly. And that royal jelly is to know that things will work out because God is faithful. And we surround ourselves with and that is when they believe that God is faithful. God is faithful. What an amazing thing for Paul to say. It takes faith to live in a crooked world. It takes faith to continue to work on something when you can't see progress. I recently saw a video on this new company that's called Virgin Galactic. Have you ever heard about that? It's about a private firm that has created a spaceship that will go out into space, and you can pay $200,000 to fly into space. And they're getting ready for their first flight, and that will happen. And they can carry 200 people. 200 people have already paid $200,000 to fly into space. Now, I don't want to be on the first flight, okay? So I saw the movie Titanic, all right? I know what happens. I don't want to be there. I might go on the second flight, but I don't want to go on the first one. Because it's faith. It's a matter of our disinterest in the world. It's a matter of our distrust of things human. That we all are a little bit hesitant. We don't want to be the lead geese, you know. We want to be down a little ways. We can see what happens to the lead geese as they go down the road. But today I'm impressed by a lot of the rhetoric of Martin Luther King. And one of the things that I've noticed that he says over and over again in his speeches in many different ways, he'll say at some point in his message, and we need all of you. And we need all of you. We need all of you to gather together to be that royal jelly, to be that tipping point where things change, where people begin to believe that something good is going to happen, where they begin to see progress happening in the world. And in all of his speeches, he talked about people coming together because the moral arc of the universe is long but it bends toward justice, that God is faithful. And I've read a lot of books about Martin Luther King, and unfortunately some of them only dwell on the civic side. They talk about how he attended Boston University, and they go in great depth on the sociology professors who were on the faculty there, and how they had studied the elements of social change. I've heard stories about how he traveled around, he talked to various politicians, and he gamed the system. But unfortunately, the one thing we miss often and we forget is that he grew up in the Baptist church. And that he would never have done what he did unless he trusted that God is faithful. That he trusted that even beyond his own life, that God would work that change in the world. One of the things that we need is a compelling sense of God's call and a conviction of the world's need. One of the key points in any person's life is to develop a healthy attitude toward challenges. Spiritual growth is a challenge. God is faithful. When Martin Luther King went down, it wasn't about him. It was about us. It was about God's Spirit entering the world. When Jesus came into the world, he knew that he wasn't the only one who could embody that Spirit. And when Martin Luther King died, he knew that he wasn't the only one who could be moved to compassion to do things differently. And he was successful because he believed that God is just and God is faithful. And Jesus knew that someone like you would come along and hear that same message and understand it and put it into practice.